See, the clock is about 4 minutes fast.
I see. Okay.
Let's see if that's accurate. No,
5:02.
my watch, yeah, it's 5:02 and it's 5:00.
Okay, we can account for that.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. So, hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Elisa. I'm the events coordinator here at the bookstore, where we now host in-person and virtual events along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything that we have confirmed, please visit our website, politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, if I could just have you silence or turn off your cell phones just to avoid any disruptions during the event. And although we don't require masks in the store, if you would like one and you don't have one, we can always provide one for you. So when we get time to opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a microphone over here by this big pillar at the end of the aisle. Please line up at that microphone just to make sure that everybody can hear your question in our recording of the event tonight. Following the Q&A, Bob will be signing up here at this big table. So if you have not already purchased your book, there are plenty of copies up at the front registers. And we ask that you line up to get your books signed also at that same pillar by the microphone, and then to have your books out and ready for us so that we can get them prepared for your personalizations. Once the event is complete, we ask that you please fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy like that long row of bookshelves over there just to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Robert J. Lieber, celebrating the release of Indispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World. The United States remains the indispensable nation. In this book, the distinguished international relations theorist and foreign policy specialist Robert Lieber argues that in a world full of revisionist powers, America's role is more important than ever. Robert J. Lieber is emeritus professor of government and international affairs at Georgetown University and has written and edited 18 books on U.S. foreign policy. He's also advised presidential campaigns, the State Department, and the drafters of U.S. national intelligence estimates. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Robert Lieber.
Oops. Thank you, Alyssa. And thanks to Politics and Prose and to Alan Watke for arrangements. And thank you all for coming on this rainy day with the specter of the overflow of Hurricane Ian out there. I want to contextualize this. I'm going to speak extemporaneously for about 20 minutes about the book. Then I welcome your questions. The tougher, the better. Many of you know me pretty well as relatives or friends, but even those who don't, I like always to say when I speak publicly that I was born and raised in Chicago. I haven't really lived there since, but we Chicagoans have an earthy, pragmatic tradition of getting to the point and not making a big deal out of it. So when the Q&A comes, don't hesitate to ask me a tough, even undiplomatic question. Unlike my more delicate-minded and fragile East Coast colleagues, you need not worry you might hurt my feelings. So let me begin about the context in which I wrote the book. I think the war in Ukraine, which broke out just after the book went to press, makes the argument of the book all the more important by a order of magnitude. It does so because it highlights this question about America's world role. Over the previous couple of decades, it was becoming more and more fashionable to make arguments of various kinds on the left politically, on the right politically, and especially among realist academics, journalists, scribblers, and others, that the U.S. Should stop spending so much of its blood and treasure in the world, that the world didn't deserve us, that we were doing it as a gift to others, and that we ought to pull back in some fashion. Those arguments for pullback ranged anywhere from outright isolationism to elegant theories about offshore balancing or restraint and so forth. Some of them on the left were virulent anti-imperialist attacks on the U.S., which blamed the U.S. for all the world's ills, and incidentally, by and large, only blamed the U.S. for imperialist behavior, nobody else. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the Iranians, not the Turks, anybody. And you can find that among Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, which is a hot commodity among the progressives, or on the public intellectuals on the left, such as Noam Chomsky, who fits that mold. But on the right, CPAC, for instance, I'm told by a friend and author, Ron Radosh, briefly the other day, took the position, a deliberately, explicitly pro-Putin position, then was subject to a barrage of criticism, I think probably from more responsible voices on the right, and after a day or so pulled it down, but not before the word got out. But you can also find statements by Ron Paul, which were issued as early as March, in effect blaming the U.S. Others of a similar mind have talked about the Americans fighting to the last Ukrainian and thereby denying agency to the Ukrainians, although this is as though this were something we've imposed on them, which is not at all the case. But even more worryingly, among the intelligentsia, especially in academia, theories about realism in its various forms fit this pattern, arguing that the U.S. can or should pull back. Now, mind you, there are political as well as intellectual reasons for that argument, that the U.S. is no longer so supreme in terms of its relative advantages in power and wealth and technology as it was a generation ago, or at least at its height right after the end of the Cold War, when Michael Mandelbaum, for instance, could describe that period as one of hyperpower. That era has passed, I should say. China in particular represents a great superpower balancer or threat to the United States that didn't really exist a generation ago or even 2 decades ago. The fact that the U.S. spent so much blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan is a case in point. Politicians of left and right have talked about ending the endless wars. So there's a context in which this comes up. But I would argue, in fact, the principal argument of the book, called the Indispensable Nation, is that the U.S. role in world affairs literally is indispensable. The U.S. plays a role that no other country, no other organization, not the UN or the EU, is capable of performing. And that if you want and value a decent world order, that order, and by the way, America's own national interests, are far better served if the U.S. remains actively engaged in a leadership position rather than pulling back. Now, by leadership and indispensable nation, I do not mean the oversimplified notions which were common, for example, in the debate about the Iranian nuclear agreement in the middle of the last decade, and again now, that you either are for war or for doing what people who don't want the U.S. to lead, or in this case, take a tougher position against Iran, want to do. That's not only grossly oversimplified, but often a direct distortion. One more point. There's a brilliant, tough-minded piece by Jamie Kirchick in the latest, I saw it online, I assume it's in the latest edition of the Atlantic, in which he argues against the anti-war gang, so to speak, that their argument, in effect, saying don't engage to help the Ukrainians, but we ought to pull back, et cetera, which takes various forms, is objectively in favor of Putin and the Russians. And he begins the essay by quoting George Orwell, who in 1942 had a brilliant rebuttal to a British pacifist who was arguing against Britain's involvement in World War II. And Orwell's comment was, under the circumstance, with Britain and the Allies fighting for their lives against the Nazis, it's objectively pro-Nazi, pro-fascist, to oppose Britain's engagement in the war. Now, we're not in that extreme a situation, but the intellectual case and the political argument for basically neo-isolationism in this context is nasty and is morally, I think, as well as strategically, deeply mistaken. And the arguments against American engagement in the world need to be understood as really inappropriate. Now, where does the term come from? Bill Clinton, in his second inaugural, used the phrase to talk about America's world role. Now, mind you, that was January 20th, 1997, a year before Madeleine Albright first used the phrase. It's normally identified with her. But its application really goes across the more thoughtful parts of the political spectrum. And I ask three questions in the book. First, is the U.S. still the indispensable nation? Second, do we still have the capacity to play that role? And third, if we don't play that role, if we really did disengage and pull back, what would the consequences be? It's a very useful thought experiment. So first question, is the U.S. still indispensable? Well, let me begin by noting that Barack Obama, who came to office in January 2009, spent a good part of his administration seeking to pull back, to get others to engage, the rest of the world to stand up in cases like Syria, for instance, or other conflicts in Europe's periphery or in the third world. He wasn't very successful with that. And at the very end of his administration, and I should add parenthetically, commercial note, I wrote a book in 2016 called Retreat and Its Consequences, in which I was rather critical of Obama's basically grand strategy, which is to try to pull back as much as possible and shift the burden to allies, the UN, and others. Something that didn't work all that well. Obama, in an interview with newspapers in the last month or two of his administration, and in a note he left on the White House desk for his successor, Donald Trump, used the phrase, in the end, the U.S. really does have an indispensable role to play. No one else can do it. Now, what does that mean? It means that the United Nations is not capable of playing that role, although its founders hoped it would be in 1945. And the basic reason for that is not complicated. It's that the heart of the UN's ability to act, as opposed to what the UN Charter says, lies in the Security Council and the 5 permanent members. As long as Russia and China have the veto, the UN is incapable of acting. So, for example, what the Russians did in Ukraine, not only now, but in Crimea in 2014, is a prima facie violation of the UN Charter, of its first key principles set out. But they're not enforceable unless the permanent 5 agree. On the rare occasions in which they do agree, and they are very rare, as in the case of driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait after Saddam invaded in 1990, that was a rare occasion. The only other instances you can point to are a more ambiguous situation with Libya years later, and earlier in Korea, where North Korea had invaded the South, And that decision was only possible because the Russians had walked out of the UN temporarily in anger over the refusal to seat communist China in place of the nationalists, even though the communists had prevailed in the civil war in China. All right, so the first point is the U.S., for all its flaws and so forth, remains the indispensable nation. No other country or organization has the capacity to do what the U.S. does. Now, mind you, the U.S. is not omnipotent. Its power is less than it was a generation ago. It needs allies and others. But in handling collective action problems, there's no substitute for the United States. So do a thought experiment. Ask yourself, what would have happened on February 24th when Russia invaded Ukraine if the U.S. had pulled back and did what the non-interventionists insisted on? The answer is without arms, equipment, intelligence, and so forth, as well as moral support, there's no way the Europeans themselves would have gotten together to do this. They didn't want to incur the threats from Russia itself if nobody else was going to act. But having the U.S. there was essential in galvanizing cooperation among the allies and drawing in others, the Australians, the Japanese, and so on. So first, the answer to the first point is, yes, the U.S. remains indispensable, albeit with not quite the same power as before. And indeed, the needs are, if anything, even greater now when you think about revisionist powers like the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and so forth. Number two, are we still capable of playing that role? Here, again, U.S. relative power is not what it was, but the U.S. still retains the size, strength, power projection, influence, allies, and others that enable it to play that role in material and geopolitical terms. It's not an open and shut matter. There has to be the use of prudence in applying the strategy, but it's still there. The real obstacle, and one that's not at all resolved, is here at home domestically. Domestically in the sense that unless there is sufficient domestic support within the United States for a foreign policy, it won't work. Think of the run-up to World War II and the concerns about Nazi Germany, the horrible discrimination against Jews in Europe, the threat of the Holocaust, and the reality of it, and Roosevelt's caution, indeed many would say excessive caution, about willing to commit the U.S. In advance or even during the war to save Jews because of his concern about the domestic political base and historic anti-Semitism in America before the war. In this case, there's a different issue. Are Americans so tired of having the U.S. lead abroad, thinking of not only Iran or Iraq and Afghanistan, but other instances? Or do they think we should continue to be engaged in leading with NATO at the UN, internationally, and elsewhere? Or not? The problem here is not so much with majorities of the American public. Opinion polls show, and here the war in Ukraine has reinforced this sense of, to some extent, sense of national identity, support for a staunch foreign policy, and so forth. But culturally and sociologically, in the universities, in many elite intellectual establishments, the foundations, and so forth, woke thinking and treatment of the American past, not as inspirational, despite America's flaws and the terrible moral blot of slavery, but understanding that for all its flaws, the United States has been unique in world affairs, and that it is the indispensable nation in that sense. It's been exceptional. If you raise a generation of young elites who believe that America is evil, that the story of America's founding is a crime, if you embrace the 1619 project of the New York Times, which makes exactly that argument, even though it was taken apart by the country's leading diplomatic historians as simply intellectually false. Again, without disregarding the moral blot, the crime of slavery, you help to raise a generation of people, whether their views are intellectually coherent on the left about anti-imperialism or based on the notion of America as an oppressor or a racist or what have you. You've got to have a population that, at least in the majority and significantly, sees a purpose in American leading in the world. And that set of issues is not resolved. Thirdly, let's say the U.S. does pull back. It does what the restrainers want. After all, you have a big group in the middle, the realist theoreticians, and institutions or organizations, such as the Quincy Institute here in Washington, funded by George Soros on the left and one of the Koch brothers on the right, which pushes this notion, and it can be found elsewhere among different outfits and groups across the political spectrum. The answer, I think, is grim. Without the U.S. leading and engaged, the NATO countries are hardly likely to play the role they're capable of doing it. And rather than sustaining a decent world order, that order would be one in which other countries step into the power vacuum. China, if you look at what it's doing at home under Xi Jinping and in the region, is imposing a dystopian Orwellian future on its own people. In its conduct under globalization, it is predatory in its economics. It has frequently violated if not the spirit, often the law or rule of arrangements it's made. And it has squeezed its neighbors in an effort to restore Chinese hegemony throughout the entire region, not just in the areas that were once part of China before the decade of China's fall between 1850 and 1949. So if you're concerned about Russia in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, their intervention in politics in the West, and it was really recently disclosed that in the last few years, Moscow has spent something like $300 million to influence elections and politics in Europe and the United States, that kind of thing. You're looking at a world in which Russia, China, Iran are relatively unrestrained. The regional coalitions against them are less likely to materialize, and it's more likely to be a world in which violence is more common, human rights are generally disparaged or less observed, as inconsistently as they are now, but things would get worse, in which economies would be less prosperous generally, in which world trade would be affected, and altogether a pretty nasty picture. Now, a lot of people will not agree with this analysis, but I think I make a persuasive case in the book. I encourage you to read it. For those of you who don't know me, if you want to email me at robert.lieber@georgetown.edu, I'm always happy to engage. So let me throw it open to questions, and don't hesitate to hurt my feelings. There's a microphone right here.
Hi, I'll just get it started, and I had the pleasure of not anticipating that I was going to be listening to this talk, and so I was a little bit maybe more open to it than I might have otherwise been.
You're more than welcome.
But thanks for the comments, and I guess without really responding directly to your critique or your analysis, I think the problem for our country, I guess you addressed it somewhat, is just the self-concept we have of being such a deeply flawed nation. And you don't have to be bought into the 1619 project or be woke, whatever that means exactly. But I think we feel that that our foreign interventions have been so deeply flawed in so many ways. And in retrospect, I think the Iraq invasion in particular was extremely problematic for the country, although Vietnam probably got us started down the dark path of whatever, feeling positive about foreign intervention, as it were. But at any rate, I think you might be completely right in terms of the indispensable role that we play. But I think subjectively, and as a self-concept as a country, we just don't feel like we're doing right just so much of the time. And this sense of being wrong in terms of what we've done, what we do militarily, I think is so deep at this point for so many people that I think it's just hard to mobilize public sentiment behind the concept, really, just that you're outlining.
You raise a point that a lot of people have made. It's a substantive and thoughtful one, but I think you have to discriminate among different events. The U.S. is a very imperfect society, but the U.S. is a very imperfect society. It reminded me of something else, but I'll leave it aside. And you have to say, compared to what? And what are the alternatives to the U.S. leading and being engaged? And as I say, being the indispensable nation and being engaged does not mean every time, everywhere, and every place, sending in the Marines or boots on the ground. That's a last resort, not a first resort. But the combination of power and diplomacy is unique. Kofi Annan, as Secretary General, once said that power by itself is blind, but diplomacy alone is impotent. The combination of the two, exercised with prudence and judgment, can be enormously effective. We don't always get it right. Humans are imperfect. Who was the great philosopher who said that humans are made of crooked timber? There should be a political philosopher who can remind. It was before Isaiah Berlin.
I think it was Kant. Immanuel Kant.
It was probably Kant.
Yeah.
And so on. But you have to differentiate. Afghanistan was fully justifiable under the UN Charter. It was authorized by NATO and by the UN itself. The conduct of the war was something else. Later on, we got stuck in a quagmire. But you need to discriminate. In the case of Libya, it looked like Gaddafi was going to slaughter in cold blood all kinds of people in western Libya, hunt them down like animals. Again, that misfired, but it wasn't the fault of the United States, per se. And finally, since I'm a social scientist, opinion data right now show that approval of NATO in the United States is at about the highest level it's been in a generation. And approval for the war in Ukraine, despite the dissident voices I've talked about, is not quite at that level, but still substantial. If I had to pick a number out of the air, I say it's probably about 2/3 or somewhere close to that, but don't hold me to the numbers. So far it's had more of a unifying effect. But now your question is something that leaders have to bear in mind. The combination of prudence, good judgment is critical. And when it goes off the rails, it can be pretty bad. Yes?
I should say I graduated from college in 1969, and the Vietnam War did terrible damage in this country. There's a reason why people are skeptical of foreign wars. That was a mistake from beginning to end, and they should have known it long before they recognized it. 2 questions, one quick, one not so quick. The quick question is, what is our backup plan on Iran? We keep saying Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. My feeling is that tells Iran they need to get it as soon as possible. And they're closer every day. The treaty, Trump made things much worse. But do we have a backup plan? I don't think the U.S. will go to war against Iran because it's getting a nuclear weapon. I don't think Americans will do that. Second question is Putin. Putin obviously thought that conquering Ukraine would be like conquering Crimea, that he'd just go in and there would be corruption and all of that. That's not what happened. But what do you make of the fact that Putin doesn't really talk about Ukraine? He does now because he's in a war and he's losing. But his initial statements, his statements in the last statement he made, are all about NATO and the West and the U.S. Is he trying to provoke World War III?
You raise enough questions to spend the next 2 hours answering. Let me try to be very concise.
Okay.
First, about Vietnam. Vietnam turned out to be disastrous, but Mark Twain once said, a cat that has sat on a hot stove will never sit on a hot stove again, but it will not sit on any stove again. There were reasons for the intervention, and you always, these judgments of where to intervene, or any major political decision, are often 60-40, 51-49, close cut things, and often, as Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, once said, you never know until it happens. Clausewitz, same thing. So you make some mistakes, and often the cost of those can be enormous, but you have to have a sense of perspective. And then second, you have to ask, what happens if the U.S. is not engaged? And it's illusory to think that there's a cost-free alternative. The cost-free alternative of pulling back and let the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese to do whatever they like in their regions is likely to be very, very severe and affect us in ways we're not even aware of at this point. And think of Russian intervention in our elections and Chinese distortions of economic arrangements and so forth. There's a lot more I could say, and it's a perfectly good question. But it's striking that the American public has very strong support for NATO right now. Opinion on this question dipped about 8 or 9 years ago. It was nearly even or even a little below that, but it's changed since then. I think in reaction to greater recognition of what China, Russia, Iran, and others represent.
So what is our plan on Iran if they just keep working and they get a nuclear reactor?
All right, well,
how can we stop it?
Let me say that
Short of war.
one of my criticisms of the anti-war club, so to speak, is that they assume that if we're nice, things will change. That the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Koreans, North Koreans, and others do what they do because we've hurt their feelings. That Russia acts that way because we've enlarged NATO and so on. I'm sorry, I strongly disagree. It deprives those actors of agency. There are reasons of history and ideology and personal interest for which are predominant. What the U.S. does is very important, but the predominant reasons are those. Xi Jinping is doing what he's doing for his own reasons and is pushing China in a much more repressive internal direction than it was a dozen years ago. For instance, just to cite one example. And the Iranians have been bent on developing a nuclear weapon for a very long time, regardless of what we say and do. And the consequences of them going nuclear will be a multi-nuclear Middle East, potentially catastrophic.
So what's our backup plan? What do we do now? They're not that far away, and the sanctions...
Well, if we don't do something, the Israelis probably will, and we'd be drawn in anyway. Whether we actually will or not is hard to say, but I think it's a mistake to let the Iranians go nuclear. And you've got a regime which in its own way is insane and talks about committing genocide. But not only its denunciations of America and Israel are not because of anything the U.S. or Israel does, but because of the bizarre fanaticism of the regime itself, which is hated, by the way. The most pro-American population in the Middle East are Iranians who hate the regime. So I'm not saying there are easy answers to this, but you raise good, tough questions.
Thank you.
Michael.
Well, I also agree with the indispensable nation thesis, but I think that one thing in this particular moment that makes it harder for people to accept, in addition to some of the assumptions of the two questioners, is what is the theory that guides American intervention? In the Cold War, we had containment theory, And that led us to determine where to intervene and where not. Not always rightly. I mean, you always need prudence. But I think people don't know what is the guide. You know, how do we determine our national interest? How do we determine whether to intervene? What's the limits other than just prudence? I mean, things like the genocide in Rwanda come up and raise that question. You know, we are, of course, against genocide everywhere. Does that mean we should intervene all the time? Whether it's in, you know, it's clearer with something that deals with Russia, China, and Iran. So I think many people would find it easier to accept America as an indispensable nation that intervenes in our national interest and to preserve world peace if they understood what theory was guiding it, what overarching geopolitical theory is guiding it, what is limiting it, other than just prudence.
I'm not saying this is easy. It requires a mix of good judgment, political prudence, political leadership, or even charisma, and a sense of confidence in the public that foreign policy leaders know what they're doing. The opposite of that occurred in mid-August of last year in the chaotic, catastrophic nature of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The majority of the American public wanted the U.S. out of Afghanistan. The Trump administration had signed an earlier agreement aiming at that end, which was going to betray the Afghans, by the way. But the way it was handled by the Biden administration not only left the American public by an overwhelming majority very displeased about it, but signaled to America's adversaries that America could be rolled, that they could be much more risk acceptant rather than risk averse. So you say to yourself, have the Chinese been squeezing their neighbors harder? Have the Russians, did Putin act as he did in Ukraine precisely because he saw what Biden and the U.S. did in August just of last year, 13 months ago, or not? You can't prove it, but there are reasons to think that that's the case.
But even the disaster, of course, the pulling out of Afghanistan was a disaster. But I think this absence of knowing what is the strategic basis of American foreign policy makes people wonder, why are we in Afghanistan? Why are we in Iraq? What is the end game? What point should we stop? What point should we pull back? You know,
Well,
so I don't want to justify what President Biden did, a disaster, but I see that they're trying to, you know, they are struggling to figure that out and of course to respond to public opinion, which is not always a good guide.
Well, Churchill once said, notably, forgive me for quoting what's become a cliche, but it fits. Americans will generally always do the right thing, but almost always after having tried everything else. This is a large, complicated country. I grew up in Chicago where politics is a contact sport. It's a contact sport today, but I think people minimize how deep-rooted and ingrained our institutions are. And I think despite the polarization and other problems we have, the odds are we will sort this out too. But some of the same goes to judgments about foreign policy. So, for example, the Clinton administration decided not only not to intervene in Rwanda, but to try to prevent others from doing it so we wouldn't be embarrassed. Rwanda broke out 6 months after the Black Hawk Down fiasco in Somalia, and the administration really got a bad black eye from it politically in ways that hurt a lot. And so they made what proved to be a catastrophic decision for which Clinton a couple of years later apologized after 800,000 people had died. In Syria, Obama, I think rightly, warned the Syrians in 2012 that if they used poison gas, that this would cross a red line. Hey, for a great power, that means something, but it also raises an issue about your credibility. They didn't have to do a lot. We didn't have to send in the Marines. We didn't have to mobilize the country. But something the U.S. had done before in various places, cruise missiles, Tomahawks, B-52 strikes at an altitude so high you can't even see the airplanes, would have made the point, doing it for a day or two or three against Assad's assets or chemical warfare installations would have made the point. Instead, he backed off. And that lesson was read loud and clear around the world, not just by the Syrians, who, by the way, when a year later, when they used chemical weapons, and again, he did nothing, that's when the lesson was read, but by others. So our allies were dispirited, and our adversaries, again, thought to themselves, the U.S. is not going to be a player, especially in the Middle East. Again, it doesn't mean you have to be reckless and so forth, but it requires judgment and appreciation of how even limited steps can convince your opponent they better back off. Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, said the greatest achievement is to win without fighting. And you can do that if you're skillful, but skill is another matter. Great question, though.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
I have the advantage of having read this splendid book, so I would urge people here who are here to actually read the book. It's a fine example of clear reasoning and addressing very controversial questions in a calm and intelligent manner, so congratulations. But I am irritated at the Quincy Institute and the leftist anti-imperialists, and we both live in the academy, so this is what we're surrounded with. However, there's an elephant in the room that you don't address at the length that I think it deserves in the book. It's not a statistical impossibility that Donald Trump could be president in 2024. If he was the president when Putin invaded Ukraine, Ukraine would now be occupied by the Russian army. And Donald Trump, all indications indicate, still dominates the Republican Party, and that neither Youngkin or DeSantis is likely to be the candidate in 2024, and neither of them has a foreign policy profile. So my question is, well, I agree with what you say about the Quincy Institute. The Quincy Institute doesn't dominate the Democratic Party yet. Biden does. And Biden is behaving in Ukraine exactly the way that you would prefer the United States act. So my question is, what do you, when it goes into paperback, are you planning to say something about Trump?
I think Jeff, you're much too pessimistic. I sincerely mean, I think I was a student of Kissinger at one point in graduate school, and I thought his analysis of American politics and strategy was, it was brilliant, but too pessimistic based on his experience in Germany. As the saying goes, during the Depression, Germany got Hitler, the U.S. got Roosevelt. I think there are historical and institutional and cultural reasons for that. I don't think Trump is quite the danger you cite. I don't think he's going to be the candidate. I think his role is less and less. I think opinion polls are showing, and I suspect he may not want to run and be humiliated, which is what I would argue would happen if he runs. Of course, there's a saying in the late Harold Wilson, British Labour Prime Minister, once said, "A week is a long time in politics." But remember, in the 1930s, renewal of the draft, conscription in 1939, only passed the House of Representatives by, or 1940, in fact, I think France had already been overrun. It passed the House of Representatives by one vote, and that's because I think it was Sam Rayburn, or his predecessor, did something a little bit not kosher. Also, the America First movement, as late as 1940, was powerful and widespread. There was an active German-American Bund. What if Lindbergh had run and defeated Roosevelt in 1940? There was even a book about it by Philip Roth and so forth. There are lots of might have beens. Often these are really close calls. So we'll see. But I think you're you and Henry are too pessimistic. Sonia.
I'm the optimist in the family. Unfortunately, I haven't read the book because Jeff was busy reading it. But so far, you've talked about America acting outside, intervening, taking an active role in the rest of the world. And I wonder what you think of the U.S. as an immigrant nation, as a nation of immigrants, and what role we could play or should play. Right now, there's actually quite a lot of anger about the fact that we aren't taking more immigrants, and there's supposedly a crisis at the border, when in fact I think we're creating a huge demand for immigrants. Do you think there is something that the U.S. could be doing, say in Central America, to deal with some of the factors that are driving immigration? And do you think our borders should be more open to the people we're actually attracting?
I think American immigration policy is a disgrace, and that both parties deserve enormous blame. Legal immigration has been an enormous strength for America. Enormous strength. It's been one of America's pillars in a way. But legal immigration. And it's scandalous that when each party has had the opportunity, majorities, typically early in a presidential term, majorities in both houses of Congress and the presidency, they've been unwilling or unable to do anything about updating and modernizing immigration policy. So instead of making it possible for people who are capable of contributing to American society by dint of their education, say, and their aspiration, you've made it harder and harder for legal immigrants to get in. And I think we all have stories about foreign friends who've gone through hell trying to cope with the requirements the U.S. imposes, whereas the borders are wide open in the South in a way that I think is catastrophic. We live in a government of laws, and it's absurd that our immigration law is not enforced at the border. The subject of Central America and so forth is another one. I think we should be much more proactively engaged with those regimes. We've sent Latin America historically, and even for those who've dealt with the State Department, has been the stepsister in foreign policy. It's always been gotten the least attention, the less everything in terms of American responsiveness. I think something obviously has to be done at the supply end to reduce that flood. Among other things, there should be a much better program that allows people from Central America who want to work but return home to do that legally. And right now it's almost impossible. So great question. I think where's Alyssa? Alyssa, are you anywhere? Oh, Andy, go ahead.
I got one more question.
Yeah.
So,
I thought she was going to cut me off, or Alan was.
I guess I should preface this by saying Bob and I are colleagues at Georgetown, and Bob actually hired me. So, but I'll try to ask a hard question nonetheless.
The department hired you.
Yeah.
A well-run academic department
You
is actually an anarcho-syndicalism, self-managing commune. Go ahead.
So we touched on what I think are two of the most pressing problems for U.S. foreign policy. Obviously, the Ukrainian situation and also the Iranian situation. The one we haven't really talked as much about is the question about Taiwan. And so, as you know, the foreign policy community has been very concerned about this issue, and Foreign Affairs has been, the journal has been practically dominated by that issue for the last couple of years. And, we want to be careful about drawing too quick analogies between what's going on in Ukraine and what the concerns are about Taiwan. They're obviously very different situations. But and the main difference, to my mind, would be that a Taiwanese situation could much more directly involve the United States much more quickly because of our naval presence. And as you know, the Chinese did the most ambitious naval exercises they've ever done in literally surrounding Taiwan as their sort of brushback pitch against the United States. As you know, we've had many close encounters of our ships and planes, one collision that started off the Bush administration, some close calls with ships basically playing chicken with 450-foot destroyers. So I just want to get your analysis, given your point of view. Is the U.S. doing enough on Taiwan? Should we be doing something different on Taiwan? And if push really comes to shove, as it could, especially given Xi Jinping's attitudes, as you said, if push comes to shove, what are we doing then?
It's a great question. I haven't talked much about it. China, under Xi Jinping, has upset our assumptions about it. Bill Clinton and others in the 90s and the aughts were confident that admitting China to the World Trade Organization, its bourgeois advancement, the wealth of its society, the growth of the middle class, its engagement in trade and the world economy and world institutions would have a modifying effect. If you go back and read the literature, not just of those politically involved, but Seymour Martin Lipset and others weighing these issues, and for certainly in the years I studied political science as a graduate student, there was a literature on the prerequisites for democratization and for societies to become democratic. And although correlation does not imply causation, generally, the more prosperous per capita a society was, more educated and so forth, the more likely it was to be pluralistic and democratic. So those who are more cautious said, well, this is bound to help shape Chinese behavior in a benign direction. Those who are less cautious made much more sweeping assumptions of technological optimism. The assumption that the more advanced they become, the more modern, the more middle class, they more become like us. Well, no, it didn't happen that way, which is a reminder. Now, I'm not trying to avoid your question, which is a good one, but it's one of those questions that has no easy answer. The same thing's true on the Iran question that you asked earlier. These are really tough calls and can lead to catastrophe or really bad decisions in one direction or another where you have imperfect information and so many contingencies it's hard to nail down. As of now, Biden has gone beyond what was decided between Henry Kissinger and Chinese leaders in 1972 to make the U.S. explicitly committed to defending Taiwan. Whether that's prudent or not, I don't know. But I do know that deterrence, as the great Michael Howard once wrote, is about deterrence, defense, and reassurance. And again, I come back to the point that above all, what you want to try to achieve with a combination of power and diplomacy is to get things done and achieve outcomes without using force. And force often winds up being used when there are uncertainties or misunderstandings about whether the other side would react. I think it's an educated guess. I think Putin assumed that there was no way the U.S. would do for Ukraine what it's doing now. And by the way, I think we should be doing more, not less. But that's another matter. So I'm not minimizing your question and saying I don't have a good answer, and moreover, I'm not a China specialist. But I think there's a reason for a tougher stand on that, because one of the issues with revisionist powers, at one point, Richard Haas and a colleague of mine at Georgetown made the argument that we ought to favor a kind of 1815 type of thing, a concert of the great powers, the top 6 world powers. Charlie Kupchan was his co-author. They wrote in Foreign Affairs to try to keep countries from going to war with each other, agree on rules of the road, and so on. It all sounded attractive and a lot better than what either the liberal internationalists were proposing with, I think, unrealistic ideas about world order, or the realists. But the problem is that 2 of the 5 or 6 great powers are Russia and China, and they are revisionist. They do, unlike the great powers in 1815 after the defeat of Napoleon, they do not accept the shared rules of the road or understandings about what world order should look like. And I think a U.S. grand strategy, and this comes back to Michael's point, can be justified on the ground that the U.S. should be committed to a grand strategy that supports, other things being equal, a decent world order. A world order in which there are certain rules of the road about international law, about the UN, about trade, about other things, human rights too. But the question about where you do that, how much you put into it, and so on, remains open. Those arguments can be caricatured, as I think the Bush administration was in 2005, 2006, when in fact Bush's second inaugural, George W. Bush, actually talked about democracy and all that, but emphasized it was up to the peoples themselves. We could support them, but it was up to them. It was nothing like the sending in the Marines argument, which you hear so often. However, come back to, I'm agnostic on what to do about China, really, apart from saying instinctively, I think Biden was right in what he's done to try to deter it, because the risk was that the Chinese misunderstand, that they take action, and they're surprised when the U.S. intervenes. But it's a huge issue for the future. Thank you all for listening. I'm glad that you came.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us tonight, and thank you, everyone, for coming out. Just a few quick reminders. If you haven't purchased your book, all those copies are going to be up at the front registers, and you can start the signing line behind me. And then just another reminder to pull up your chairs. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Glad to do it. And I appreciate the rules of the road for it. I mean, I prefer to do it extemporaneously, to contextualize it, besides Q&A.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. Yeah.
In other words, it answers the question.
Yeah.
Why is this book relevant?
Yeah.
Hi.
It's no worries. It's just 2 pages in. There we are. Thanks so much.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I do. Well, we're going to get it too, in the spirit of Friends book, my book from the French. You never know, I may still write one second. Oh, there's Ben. Nice job. All right, we gotta go.
I was going to ask the Trump question.
Ben, I know you. Yeah. Life is good. Yeah, good. What you do here? Great. Well, well, it's a long-term
Yeah.